What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back with a different video for you guys, another video for sure. But yeah, I wanted to actually talk about something that doesn't really get talked about a whole lot when it comes to threads and discussions here in YouTube for metal. I wanted to talk about metal producers, like the guys behind the buttons and the computers and the consoles when recording albums and producing them to help make sure they sound as good as humanly possible. So I wanted to do a list of 10 amazing metal producers. Again, this is not really a top 10 video. This is just 10 of my favorite producers. Of course, there are a multitude of amazing producers out there in metal that help bands out getting the right sound that they want for an album. And, well, these are, in my opinion, 10 of the most legendary producers of all time in metal. So we're going to kick off this with a pretty big one, and that is, of course, Scott Burns. So yeah, Scott Burns, well, world-renowned for his work in the Tampa area, More Sound Studios, working with thrash bands, grindcore bands, but primarily death metal. After all, when you think of Florida death metal, a name that will come up in terms of a key figure is Scott Burns. After all, his first works were like help with engineering early on in like the late 80s, but his first album he actually worked on in terms of production was Obituary Slowly We Rot. Then did Sepultura Beneath the Remains, actually went down to Brazil to do that album, and then came back and did like Atheist Piece of Time and many other albums to follow throughout the 90s. Granted, yeah, he would stop producing full-time in about 97, 98. By that point, he was just pretty much disenfranchised with the entire music industry as a whole, and he's done, I think, 2 albums since he retired. He did Obituary Frozen in Time, their comeback album, in 2005, and then I think last year he actually made a one-off return to help with Kelly Schaefer's new project, To the Dirt. So maybe a chance he'll be back at it on a rare basis, but you never know. But yeah, Scott Burns, he was just a legendary figure in that whole scene. And also what I'm doing for this video is also talking about my favorite album each of these producers worked on. My favorite production and mix that Scott Burns did would be Cannibal Corpse to Bleeding. Not only because it's my favorite Cannibal Corpse album, but also just the way everything came together production-wise. And this was one of the only albums during the early run of Cannibal Corpse when it came down to recording that there was some stress going on. Like in the documentary, they talked about like how Barnes and Burns were kind of butting heads over the mixes, and Scott goes, you know what, you can mix your own fucking record, I'm out of here. And just, getting pissed at times, but the results were worth it. I mean, after all, like, everything is mixed together beautifully. The tones in the recording are heavy, chunky, and nasty. Like, all the tones of the guitars, the bass, and the drums, and the vocal mix just adds, like, an icing on top of this gory cake. So, I would say my favorite Scott Burns production would be Cannibal Corpse to Bleeding. So the next producer I'm going to be talking about is another really prolific one. Why did I say prolific? I don't know what is wrong with me. But anyways, another prolific producer in all of metal, not just in extreme metal, and also vocalist, guitarist, musician extraordinaire, Peter Tägtgren, who most people know him from Hypocrisy. And yeah, it's like amazing bands he has, like Hypocrisy and his industrial symphonic band Pain. But some people might know Peter more as a producer because he has worked on countless albums for countless bands, whether they be Swedish or Norwegian or Danish, Finnish, just a ton of bands he's worked on production-wise over the years. And one thing I really love about with Peter's production approach is that he'll help maintain a natural, slightly grittier tone, no matter what subgenre he's producing for, whether it be death metal, melodic death metal, black metal, even power metal, because he did work with Sabaton for a good number of years. So when it came to try and pick my favorite Peter Tägtgren production, it was kind of difficult, but I decided I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to pick a Hypocrisy album, and I picked Abducted. I just love the overall tone and the mix and everything that has to do with this album production-wise. Like, the Boss HM2 tone comes out on here. I think this is one of the only albums where that tone lives in Hypocrisy's catalog. Like, this, sound-wise, it sounds raw, gritty, but it's pretty damn well mixed. Like, all the tones are there. Peter's vocal tones are there in the mix. And, of course, the album itself is fantastic. Maybe my favorite Hypocrisy album. Depends on when I decide to do a ranking for Hypocrisy, but this would be pretty high up there if it's not at the top. But yeah, production-wise, I fucking love this album. Like, everything sound-wise. This is the kind of production I love to hear from old-school melodic death metal. So the next one, and this producer is probably going to garner a lot of discussion because, well, the settings he uses still to this day. However, I'm going to say he is among the greatest of all time, and that is none other than Andy Sneap. Of course, Andy Sneap, a British producer and guitarist. Like, he's guitarist for bands like Sabbath, the British Sabbath, also currently playing live for Judas Priest. So he's a phenomenal guitarist, but little did we know, he's an amazing producer. Now, the controversy here is that a lot of people seem to get really tired of Andy Sneap's production because, like, the settings are the same. It's just only minute changes, like, depending on the band, what they want for their guitar tone. With pedals and whatnot, those are really the only differences, but, like, drum tones are very much the same in every band he works with. So yeah, some people might be getting sick of Andy Sneap's production because, yeah, the settings are very similar across the board. However, in my opinion, does he really need to change settings at all? Because it sounds fantastic. It doesn't sound overproduced, sounds natural. Like, the drum tones he picks for whatever band he's working on sound natural but huge. The guitar tones, he makes sure the guitars are heard. He makes sure the bass is audible. Makes sure the vocals cut through very well. Like, he knows what he's doing, obviously, because he's worked with numerous bands now for about almost 30 years. Like, he's worked with Testament for 25 years now. He's worked with Megadeth, now recently Judas Priest, Saxon, Zentrix, just Arch Enemy, so many bands. However, my favorite album that he produced in terms of the recording quality is going to be Accept, Blood of the Nations. Of course, it's the big comeback album for Accept and what started them on their comeback roll. They're still on right now, despite the new album not being that great. But this album, I think in terms of production for an old school classic heavy metal band, this is arguably one of, if not the heaviest classic heavy metal albums of the last 15 years, because Andy Sneap really made sure Accept came back strong and with monstrous sounding everything. Guitars, bass, drums. Also, this is the first one with Mark Tornillo on vocals, and I think he's, again, better than Udo. Sorry to Udo fans, but Mark Tornillo, I think, has a better range. But this album, just mainly for the tones and how heavy this is, like Teutonic Terror, The Abyss, Shades of Death, Beat the Bastards, just awesome tones across the board on these albums from Accept in recent times. So Andy Sneap definitely knows how to get the best out of a band in terms of production, and this album is certainly proof of that. Alright, now the next one, This one shouldn't come as a surprise because you guys know my pretty much worshiping at the altar of this guy. After all, I got to interview him over 2 years ago, and I still don't know what to make of it because it's like, what? But anyways, I'm going to be talking Dan Swano. Yes, I know there's probably some people out there that are probably sick of hearing me talk about Dan Swano, but guess what? I don't care. Dan Swano is the man when it comes to like anything he sets his mind to, whether it be singing, playing guitar, bass, drums, keyboards, producing, or mixing albums, because he's primarily now a mixer and masterer of albums nowadays. Granted, he still has his projects, but still, that's his primary role in metal now. But back when he was first starting production, like he said that like he started doing stuff at the very end of the 80s and into the 90s where he would be helping out with other bands' demos. And he didn't start going into full-on producing full-length albums until about like 1992, 1993, somewhere in that time frame. And he's been in the game for that whole time. Granted, he took a break in between, well, at least when it came to doing other bands, between like, I think 97 and 2004. And the only reason he came back was thanks to November's Doom asking him to mix their album Pale Haunt Departure. So that was 20 years ago, and Dan's still in the mixing game to this day, and occasionally will produce albums. Hell, he produced the new Skeletal Remains album that came out this year, and it sounds phenomenal. And of course, he's worked with many bands over the years, everyone from Opeth to Dissection, Asphyx, Marduk, just a bunch of bands. However, if I were to personally choose my favorite production sound Dan Swano ever did for an album, this is going to be a bit of an oddball pick, but I'm going to go with one of his very first works, and that is Catatonia, Dance of December Souls. After all, the story about how Anders and Jonas managed to get Swano to do this was because they formed Catatonia in, like, I think 91, and they were huge Edge of Sanity fans, and they idolized Dan Swano to the point where they wrote a letter to Dan, like, hey, we're from Stockholm, and we love Edge of Sanity. We would love if you can help us out with a demo we're working on. We have a band called Catatonia. Would you like to help us on our demo? And Dan was like, no problem, that sounds cool. They did the Java Elohim Meth demo, and then, of course, after that demo got around, they would go back to Dan to do this album, which Dan was like, perfect, I wanted to work with you guys again. And I will say, in terms of atmosphere in production, this is one of the most atmospheric albums Dan ever worked on, because, you know, and one other good thing about Dan's production, again, kind of similar to, I would say, Peter Tägtgren in a way, where he keeps things natural and raw, but still sounds great. This is a principal example of how you can sound raw and gritty, but still come across as like, holy crap, this sounds incredible. Because, I mean, the way everything's layered, the guitars, the bass, the drums, the vocals, and the occasional synths, and maybe even symphonic touches they'll throw in on here, it's all layered really well, and everything's well balanced in the mix, and the tones, while raw and gritty, they sound perfect for the early mid-90s, especially in underground metal. So yeah, I would say my favorite Dan Swano production would be the first Catatonia full-length. This is some really nice sounding stuff. Alright, and then next up, we're gonna move away from, you know, Scandinavia, England, and America for this next one, and that is going to be the legendary Harris Johns, German producer, and he was primarily active in the 80s, in the early 90s, and then even the early 2000s. He would take breaks, and I don't know what was the last thing he worked on, but Harris Johns is a legend in German metal because he has worked with numerous bands over his tenure. Bands like Creator, Voivod, Pestilence, Halloween, Immolation even. Just a bunch of bands. However, I would say, and Coroner even, he even worked with Coroner early on, and his style is kind of equivalent to some of the producers here in America when it came to thrash. Like, I would say, you know, Alex Perialis, Randy Burns. Like, he was kind of going for that type of production style, but bringing it over across the pond to Germany. However, there is one band that I immediately associate Harris John's production with, and my pick for my favorite Harris John's production would be Sodom, Agent Orange. I almost went with Tapping the Vein. However, I will say I probably will go with Agent Orange in terms of production because the mix, just perfect. Like, Tom Angel Ripper's grizzly, distorted bass tone is audible throughout. The guitar tones, perfect for thrash. The drum tones are massive. And the vocal tones that cut through the mix really wonderfully. And Harris Johns, like, you know, he started working with Sodom on the Experts of Sodomy EP that came out 2 years before this. And then later in '87 doing my personal favorite Sodom album, Persecution Mania. Still raw, but it was a far better sound than how Sodom were in the beginning. This, in terms of production, I think is where Harris perfected his production style for any band that followed after. I mean, this album itself is a classic amongst thrash fans, but sound-wise, this might be up there amongst the 10 best sounding thrash metal albums of all time in terms of production. So, yeah, this is just awesome production done by the one and only Mr. Johns. Hopefully it's not a reference to his penis. Alright, so we're halfway through, and next up we're going to go back to Scandinavia for this next one. And of course, whenever you're talking about production in extreme metal, this guy has to be brought up, and that is none other than Thomas Skogsberg. Swedish producer who I think is still going, even though he's kind of more on a rare basis. Kind of like, I guess, Scott Burns now. So it's kind of parallel with he and Scott Burns. And it's appropriate because many people, especially in the 90s, kind of looked at Thomas Skogsberg as the Stockholm or the Swedish version of Scott Burns, because many bands would go that were in primarily in the Scandinavia era or area. God, I cannot speak. Scandinavian area of Europe decided to go to Thomas because they loved what he was doing at the beginning of the decade. And, you know, he's worked with many bands, mostly Swedish bands, but he has worked with some Finnish bands and bands from other countries. You know, he's worked with Dismember, Grave, Amorphous, even Catatonia he worked with a little bit. However, my favorite production Thomas Skogsberg ever did, this will be another no-brainer, Entombed Left Hand Path. The first studio full-length, to my knowledge, that he did. I think it was between this and the first Tiamat album, Sumerian Cry. However, I think this one is definitely more synonymous with Thomas Skogsberg, not only because the album itself is one of the top 3 greatest death metal albums of all time, but the sound, the mix, the atmosphere, the layers, everything that Thomas put in for Entombed came to life. You know, like that HM2 tone, that guitar pedal, Thomas managed to find a way to make it sound not terrible, but make it sound gnarly and awesome to listen to. And again, I'm an HM2 slut for a reason because of this album. And I mean, you know, the grizzly bass, the nice, like, natural sounding drums, and the way the vocals, how he mixed the vocals into everything and all the other layers. Mwah. Chef's kiss. Mamma mia. Alright, next up, we're going to go back to England for this, actually for the next 2 I'm going to be talking about. And, well, when you're talking about British producers, other than perhaps Andy Sneap, this is the one that I think a lot of people, especially fans of old school heavy metal, classic heavy metal, will definitely latch on to, and that is the late great Martin Birch. Of course, Martin Birch, you know, he was primarily a rock producer, However, he got into doing more metal stuff by the very end of the 70s, heading into the 80s, like he had done like Rainbow Rising, and by the beginning of the decade of the 80s, he'd done like Blue Oyster Cult, Black Sabbath. I think he also did stuff for Deep Purple, I believe. However, the big band that a lot of people, well, I'll save that for a moment, but what was cool about Martin Birch's production style was, again, considering the times, technology was still gradually trying to catch up with how bands were wanting everything to sound for their albums. But Martin was able to adapt to all those things quite well and get new technology, kind of stay ahead of the pack a little bit and make sure that any band he got to work with sounded as good as possible for their recordings, so that way nothing sounded half-assed. But of course, the big band that most people associate Martin Birch production with is, of course, Iron Maiden, and I picked Power Slave as my favorite Martin Birch production. I mean, again, when it comes down to the mix, especially when you have Steve Harris helping out in the production and him being a bass player, he wants to make sure his bass is heard in the mix, but also he and Martin do a good job working together to make sure all the other instruments and vocal patterns and layers are audible in the mix too, so that way everybody shines. And with Martin at the helm, I mean, he was able to bring out the best out of Iron Maiden back in the 80s. That started with Killers, and that relationship would end up to Fear of the Dark in 92. So an 11-year run that Martin had with Maiden, and I would still say in terms of production, this is the best work Martin ever did, because holy crap, like all the layers, all the balancing and the mix of everything, again, is Mamma Mia chef's kiss. Nothing more, nothing less, and it sucks that he's no longer with us. May he rest in peace, God rest his soul. But yeah, this is a phenomenal production job by the late great Martin Birch. Alright, we have a few more to go, and like I said, the next one we're going again back to England, and for this next one, perhaps when it comes down to extreme metal in the 90s, even up to this day, even though he does more mainstream bands, but back in the very end of the 80s and all throughout the 90s, when it came down to extreme metal, you either went to Scott Burns, Thomas Skogsberg, Peter Tägtgren, Dan Swano, or Colin Richardson. So Colin Richardson's another one I wanted to highlight on here, because Colin's production, especially in the 90s, can kind of go toe-to-toe with Scott Burns when it came down to the death metal stuff, especially because you listen to some of Scott Burns' mixes and some of Colin Richardson's mixes, and they're so close on certain albums and bands. Like, you listen to the first two Gorguts albums, Considered Dead, that was done by Scott Burns. Erosion of Sanity, done by Colin Richardson, but yet they share so much in terms of similarities as far as production goes. Even though it's two different guys, they sound really close. So it's like Colin was maybe trying to catch up to what Scott was doing and build on that a little bit. Because, like, similar to Scott Burns, it's like he made sure everything sounded monstrous but still raw and heavy and well balanced and mixed and well done as far as tone. And my pick for my favorite Colin Richardson production and mix, I'm going Bolt Thrower for Victory. Even though it's not my favorite Bolt Thrower album in terms of songs, but in terms of production, I will say this is probably the best produced Bolt Thrower album of all time. And of course, Colin Richardson at the helm. And holy crap, he wanted to make sure everything sounded huge on his album. Like the guitar tone, massive, bass tone is nice and grisly. The drums sound like cannons going off. And of course, making sure Carl Willett's powerful roar is like powerful in the mix to make sure that, hey, you better pay attention to what this band's trying to tell you. So I would say, for me, best Colin Richardson production goes to the almighty Bolt Thrower. The TH is an F for some reason. But whatever. Both are for victory. My favorite Colin Richardson production. All right, we have two more left, and well, we're going to go back to Sweden for these next two because honestly, besides Dan Swano, Thomas Skogsberg, and Peter Tägtgren, these are two other producers you could go to in Sweden and get an amazing sound out of whatever it is you're going for. Next guy I'm going to be touching on is going to be none other than the legendary Fredrik Nordstrom. Now, Fredrik, besides production, he is a damn good guitarist. Like, he comes from the band Dream Evil, so he's definitely out there still doing music in terms of his own stuff, but more people know him for production. Now, to my knowledge, Fredrik Nordstrom didn't really take off as a producer until about the mid-90s, and from there, lots of bands have gone to him for production, like, Opeth. I want to say In Flames went to him as well. Even as recently as Obscura have gone to Fredrik Nordstrom to help get as good of a sound as they possibly could for an album. And Fredrik will work with any style of metal, no matter what it is. I mean, hell, he even worked with metalcore legends Darkest Hour, I believe. So yeah, he's willing to go all over the place. However, when it comes to Fredrik Nordstrom production, like, it's excuse me, whew, definitely like making sure it sounds huge but still sound natural at the same time. But there's one band and one album that you immediately associate Fredrik Nordstrom production with, and that is, of course, At the Gates, Slaughter of the Soul. I mean, the album itself is brilliant, but when it came down to production, holy crap, for an early Gothenburg melodic death metal album, holy crap, did Fredrik Nordstrom make it sound raw, heavy, and nasty. Of course, you still have the HM2 tone, although it was mixed with the Boss Metal Zone pedal, which is how you get the tone for Slaughter of the Soul. So to any band out there that truly wants to sound as close to Slaughter of the Soul as you can, guitar tone-wise, just take the Boss HM2 and the Boss Metal Zone and put it together, and you get the guitar tone from Slaughter of the Soul. But like everything else in terms of production, like, the bass is there, the drums sound killer, and of course Thomas Lindberg's vocals cut through the mix very well without overpowering everything, and that's because Fredrik wanted to make sure, again, everybody shined in terms of the mixes. So my favorite Fredrik Nordstrom production easily goes to Slaughter of the Soul. And then finally, for my final producer I wanted to highlight, and this is back again to Sweden, and he and Fredrik Nordstrom can kind of go toe-to-toe for arguably the greatest producer in Sweden, and I'm going to be talking about Jens Bogren. Jens Bogren, who I think in terms of age is the youngest out of everybody that I'm talking about. I would say, yeah, he's easily the youngest. I think he's only mid-40s, and he's still going strong. I mean, hell, he's done countless work this year. He's done work for many years in his career. I think he's been going strong since about the 2000s. And of course, he's worked with a bunch of bands in his own right. He's worked with Bloodbath. He's worked with Swallow the Sun. He's worked with Bortnagar, so many bands. However, in my opinion, the best production in Jens Bogren's career would have to go to one of my favorite progressive metal albums / progressive death metal albums of all time, Opeth Ghost Reveries. After all, when I was looking up producers, when I saw Jens Bogren, like in terms of like what I listened to from him first, this was the album that got me into his style of production, which is very clean, but still not overproduced, making sure that like it sounds as huge as possible, as clear as possible, but still maintaining heaviness. And the way he was able to produce, mix, and layer everything on this album, it's beautiful. It is absolutely beautiful. Like, he makes sure the bass still has its voice. The guitar tones are heavy and massive on here. Drum tones definitely kind of sound a little bit more I don't know if I want to say jazzy or not, but it has like a jazzier tone, and I think that works well on this album. And also making sure Michael Ockerfeld's vocals definitely stand out, and also any keyboards, making sure the keyboards are prominent but not taking over everything. I mean, I almost went with like a recent Swallow the Sun album because I love how Jens just makes Swallow the Sun sound as big as he can. But I have to go back to the early beginnings, and I still say this is the golden standard for Jens Bogren production. It's Opeth Ghost Reveries. And that does it for this video. I mean, there's, again, countless great producers out there in metal. And actually, I actually want to see you guys who make videos that watch my channel and watch my videos. I want to hear from you guys. Who are some of your favorite metal producers of all time? Like I said, I could have brought up many others, but these were, in my opinion, the 10 that I think either have the best resume or are honestly the most like legendary and influential out of all of them. So yeah, of course there's still many other great ones, but I would like to hear from you guys. Who are some metal producers I didn't bring up in this video that you love? And if you want to make a video, tag me in it and I'll watch. Or if you don't want to make a video, just let me know in the comments below some of your picks for favorite metal producers. And also don't forget to mention what's your favorite album by that producer. But anyways, thank you guys for watching this. Of course, this is being posted while I'm on vacation, so I hope you guys thought this was a good enough video to kind of keep everything active while I'm away. But anyways, thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Keep your horns high and your dreams wet.
Thank you for your patronage.